Hello everyone and welcome back to Dragalia Foundry, a fan channel where everything Dragalia Lost can be found. This video is going to contain my review of the latest summon showcase. It's another prize showcase, this time around featuring a new light bow adventurer, Isaac, as well as a new light dragon, Raphael. Isaac takes part in the most recent event, Children of Yggdrasil, and Raphael is the archangel associated with Rosarda, who was introduced back in the Divine Deception event. So these characters are on the newer side. I wouldn't say they're huge fan favorites in the player base, but I think that some players may have grown attached to them pretty quickly here, so I'd imagine some of you out there are going to know whether or not you want to summon just for the aesthetic on these characters, whether you want them in your collection, etc. But for everyone else out there, I'll try and answer the question of whether or not you should summon right away from a gameplay standpoint, and I believe the answer is going to be no. I don't think that there's any category of player where I'd recommend summoning on this showcase. Even if you're trying to bolster your light collection, I don't necessarily see this as the best opportunity to do so, and I think that we're likely to get a pretty good Gala remix mid-month here with Gala Leonidas coming up, which might be a further reason to save. So in general, I'm going to say no on this showcase. I think it's one of the more cut and dry showcases we've had. The previous showcase, Gala Mascula, actually filled a niche for Dispel in the water element that, you know, maybe you summon if you don't have Lapis, maybe not if you already have her. On this particular showcase, I don't think Isaac really does anything like that, where he is irreplaceable, so to speak, or fulfills a much needed role in endgame content. It's possible down the road he may be more beneficial to have, and we'll talk about some of those possibilities, but from my high level take, I would say this is a pretty safe skip. Alright, so let's take a look at the showcase page here. Remember, with the prize showcases, you do get extra goodies as you summon, but it's not really a reason to summon. It's more of an added bonus if you already plan on summoning, and I would say you probably only want to summon on this if you just really grew attached to or grew fond of these characters right away, and you must have them as part of your collection. It's also a very long duration showcase, so you have plenty of time to make a decision. You're going to be able to see what the mid-month Gala remix is before you decide whether or not you want to pull the trigger on this one. So let's start off by talking about Isaac's kit here, and I think this video should be pretty quick compared to some of the other analysis videos on these new banners. Isaac is a new support type light bow, and his first skill, Wield Fury, deals damage to enemies directly ahead and activates one of the following effects at random. It either increases the user's strength, their attack rate, recovers the user's HP, or gradually fills the user's skill gauges. And the skill also creates a buff zone that grants the same effect as the buff applied to the user by this skill. So actually a very cool skill. It's shareable with a high SP cost or skill energy cost. The actual cost to use it is not too low, not too high, but certainly reasonable as a bow. For some bows, you see things as low as 2300, 2500 is pretty standard, so this can take a little bit longer without counting out exact rotations that this would take, but this is pretty normal, I would say. And then the interesting thing here is the buff zone and the fact that apparently these buffs are not affected or dispelled by Curse of Nihility or Nihility. So these buffs are immune, they're viable in the Sinister Dominion, even against Lilith, where other light adventurers who rely upon buffs may have faced some setbacks because of her dispel of buffs. This apparently does work, so you can see here the buff zones and the personal buffs both last 10 seconds, and it gives you the amount. So the strength is 5%, attack rate is 5%, the regen is 2.9 seconds, 10 potency. Every 2.9 seconds, it's 10 potency. Verdure Blessing skill charger, every 1 second you get 2%. It lasts for 10 seconds, so that's like 20% of your skill gauge refilled. And then the buff zone, you get 10% strength up, 10% attack rate. The regen is also doubled in potency, and the skill charger is the same. So an interesting thing here is he applies one of these to himself at random, he also creates the buff zone. So one of my initial questions about how Isaac works, and I wasn't able to see this in the Twitter video for him because they don't display the UI at the bottom of the screen, but one of my questions is just, does he benefit from both the buff zone as well as his own personal buff to himself? Like, he gets a personal buff on himself, but by standing in the buff zone, does he also double up on that? So for example, let's say you roll strength. Is his total benefit going to be actually 15% strength as opposed to just the 5% personal strength as long as he's standing in the buff zone? I believe the answer would be yes, but I could be wrong on that. Maybe he can only have like one or the other on these, but that would be kind of weird because the buff zone's a higher amount. So I think that these actually stack. So like for Isaac, if he stays in the zone, my assumption here is that if he's in there for the whole 10 seconds, he wouldn't just get 20% of his skill gauges back, he would actually get 40%, whereas other characters would only get the 20% from the buff zone. Anyway, that's one nuance that I'm not completely sure about. The buffs are relatively small in size, but considering they are Curse of Nihility immune, I do think that the attack rate is pretty good here, as is the skill charge. The strength is modest, but Isaac has some other ways in his kit to boost strength, and the regen might be the most, the miss among the rolls here, maybe the worst or weakest of them. But with the SP cost on this being relatively low, and from what I understand, it being possible to actually stack these different buff zones, this seems pretty good to me. Buff zone duration cannot be increased using buff skill time worm prints, but the personal buff duration could be increased. I guess you could maybe use that to let him charge up a little bit extra on his skill gauges, something like that, but maybe not worth it, just thinking about how you'd actually fit that into his kit. So I would say when you look at the damage that this does, it's not very high, so this is a pretty low damage for a skill, but this is more of a support character, true to what's actually labeled here, where you'll want to use this often and spam this skill to create multiple overlapping buff zones, power up your team that way. That is probably, at a glance, how I would try build Isaac with some type of skill haste. Maybe you could still use an offensive dragon rather than using a pure buff bot dragon like Tieshan Gongju. So you could maybe use like Gala Reborn Jeanne d'Arc or something if you want to try go for a little bit of personal DPS as well. But I see his potential here as more of the buffs that he provides. And similarly, when we get to the abilities, we'll see more of that with him dabbling in amps. His second skill is just a pure damage dealing skill, Lightning Hunt, but it doesn't seem really special at all to me. It just does damage, no side effects. He's not a flash burn enabler, not a paralysis enabler in any way. It's just a straight up damage dealing skill. It's honestly kind of refreshing and weird to see a skill like this in this day and age in Dragalia. Like, everything is usually pretty complicated or requires a lot of reading. Like, it's just this much damage for this rate as far as the SP goes. So nothing too special there in my opinion. This is why I say I feel like Isaac is sort of replaceable. Like, in hard difficulty content where you want to use light adventurers, namely Tartarus and Lilith, let's say, there are certain pieces that you need or want on your teams. Against Lilith, for example, a healer is very hard to replace. You might be able to get by if you're doing some kind of special strategies without a healer, but most likely that's going to occupy one slot on your team guaranteed, probably like a Hildegard or an Estelle, maybe a Vixel. And besides your healer, another thing that you probably want to have is some type of flash burn enabler. If you have a flash burn enabler, you're able to use flash burn Punisher worm prints, which will significantly increase your DPS against Lilith. That is another slot that you probably want to have occupied, so characters like Rosarda, Ilia, or even Irene fulfill that role. And then when you move on from there, depending on what you're doing, let's say you're trying to auto expert, for example, well, that has its own set of characters that fit that you'd want, such as Julieta as a lead tank character, or maybe you'd want Xiao Jing if you don't have Rosarda as a backline HP co-ability. So the amount of flex slots that you have for somebody like Isaac, I just feel is a little bit narrow, even though he can, contribute a little bit of healing here, and the skill recharge is actually pretty cool too. So that's why I say it's difficult to sort of conceptualize where he would fit in. And then against Master Lilith, you probably could throw him on your team, and he might be effective. I'm sort of thinking in my mind of comparing him to like Peony, because he has a similar skill recharge thing that she does. And she's not exactly a great damage dealer against Master Lilith, but her skill recharge in combination with her co-ability just boosting light damage, her co-ability might in and of itself be better than all the buff spamming that Isaac is doing. In my mind, at least, that is a real possibility, especially when you consider that another thing you'll often want on light teams is some type of paralysis enabler, and Peony is able to do that. So amid a healer, a paralysis enabler, a flashburn enabler, maybe some type of tank or lead character, your slots get filled pretty fast, and I just don't see Isaac easily slotting in to what all is happening. In the new Shadow Legion in the Trials of the Mighty, I think he could be actually pretty sweet. It feels like his ability to hit a lot of enemies, throw it on buff zones, heal people, those feel like valued things in that trial, and there's also a hit count component to it, and bows are pretty good with the hit count. It's also limited, so you can only use bows, wands, and staff characters, so that's another reason why you might want to take him there. But in general, for the end game, Tartarus, I would say it's even more competitive because regular buff bots whose effects would get dispelled by Curse of Nihility aren't even inhibited in Tartarus. So like in Tartarus, you have to think about, would I just be better off with Chitose, for example, rather than Isaac? And the answer might be yes. Maybe Chitose is better than Isaac. So that's how I see Isaac lining up against current content, and I would say that's true thinking ahead to Legend Tartarus as well. The other possibility is that Azura, if the second phase when that releases favors light element adventurers, meaning Azura switches from being light element themselves into being a shadow element boss. So if you want to use Isaac in phase 2 there, let's say that happens on the master difficulty, hypothetically, well, maybe that would be relevant. I mean, that is Curse of Nihility territory. That is another Sinister Dominion quest. But in general, I think that it's less important to build for phase 2 just because master is not a mode that needs to be farmed. So when you're thinking about Lilith and Yaldabaoth, yes, getting those clears every week of Master, it's very helpful to have characters like Lapis or Feeny for Lilith, and for Yaldabaoth, it's nice to have Gala Knot, or maybe some other global AoE type characters or dragons like Midgardsormr Zero. It's helpful to have those, but it's far more important that for the expert difficulty, the primary element of the Sinister Dominion is handled. So that's why even when I think about Azura, I can't see, I don't think Isaac will help in the first phase, because I would be shocked if Azura's first phase is Shadow Element just like Lilith was. And then in the second phase, that is like more of a nice to have to take on that master, but it's not the thing that you actually grind, which is expert, where it's more important to have those characters. So for Azura, I think having good shadow characters is going to be far more critical, basically. And for all these reasons, like, I think Isaac, it's a cool design, but I just don't see it being a necessity, and I feel like it has a hard time to really fit in with what's going on right now. His co-ability and chain co-ability here are skill haste and then poised shadow res plus 7%. So these poised effects give the bonus if you're in a buff zone, so this kind of fits with what he has going on, and skill haste is standard on bows. His abilities are Guardsman of the Verdure 2. Using Wield Fury grants the user a strength amp with a maximum team amp level of 2. Also, the user's shadow resistance is increased by 5% when they're in a buff zone. Seems totally fine, totally adequate to me. Actually pretty good as far as ramping up strength amps, but you'd want to use him alongside a character like Gala Reborn, who has a max team amp level of 3 to really bank out on this effect, because the cap is just a little low with a max team amp level of 2. So even though Isaac can accumulate that level quickly, it's not that big of a bonus compared to if you're able to get to the max team amp level of 3 that's available through Gala Adventures and a few others at this point as well. Also, the Shadow Resistance buff is fine. Maybe if there's some unavoidable damage or it's just really tight in, like, let's say Azura Phase 2, and this is a big if you actually use Light Adventures there even, then this could help, but like it's marginal. You also get the Shadow Res on the Chainco ability. Poison Res 100%, probably good prospectively, thinking about Legend Tartarus and Azura, if that Phase 2 does incorporate Shadow Element Azura, then this could potentially help. Or in the future, if the other Sinister Dominion battle Phase 2, whichever one has a Shadow Element boss in Phase 2, maybe they'll cause poison. And if that's the case, then this will be helpful down the road. I think that there's still probably a lot better Curse Res characters than Poison if I had to stack them up against each other, so adding to the Poison Res collection is kind of nice, but for existing content, I don't think it really makes too big of a difference. And then Poise Strength 20%, nice little plus 20% that you should pretty much always have on this character if you're able to throughout your buff zones. Assuming you're not cursed or something, you should always be able to utilize that. Isaac seems like a fine character, and maybe I'm underestimating a little bit how rapidly you can throw out some of these buff zones, so it could be better than I'm thinking here. But again, I just don't really see like what the point is or what the purpose is, especially when I think there's very stable existing comps to auto Lilith, to do solo for Master of Lilith, to auto Tartarus on Expert, and on Master you could solo, you could do co-op, using off-element adventures even. I just don't know exactly. I don't see how Isaac can really break in to what's already happening. Yes, you could use him for fun. I have no doubt that he can clear, but I don't think that he's going to have a big influence. Let's move on and talk about Raphael next, and I think that the Raphael discussion should be pretty brief here. So I kind of want to summon for Raphael, just because I think that it'd be cool to have all the apostles and their associated dragons. Right now I don't have a lot of extra sunlight stones or anything though, so even if I summon her, I'm probably not going to be able to use her, so I'm kind of thinking that I may be better off just saving rather than going for her at this time. Her skill, Angelic Justice, is kind of neat. It does modest amount of damage. It's not great, but the cool thing about it is it immediately readies the user's second skill for use. Kind of like what we saw on Ramiel, but his, I think, charges the second skill. No, I guess it readies it, right? I'm trying to think. Ramiel also provides like regen on both the first and second skill, but I think he readies the second skill. It's kind of a weird effect that you don't see too often. So it's pretty cool to see. If there are ever adventures that release with like really good, impactful second skills, this could have a little bit of potential. Like Gala Reborn comes to mind as a character with a really big payload on his second skill that maybe this could work well with. But why I'm skeptical of Raphael is mostly her abilities. They're just not too powerful compared to what we already have in the form of Gala Reborn Jeanne d'Arc. Raphael by no means looks bad, but I just think that it's going to be hard to compete with Gala Reborn Jeanne d'Arc, or even dragons like Daikokuten, Corsair Phoenix. 60% Strength Aura can get on the level of like a Corsair Phoenix. Obviously, it's on the level of a Cupid, and this second ability will likely make her better in a lot of scenarios. But considering that Corsair and Cupid are unbindable via Draconic Essences, so essentially free to unbind over time, it's just hard to recommend investing in a dragon like this that's not on the cutting edge of power when we have others, like Gala Reborn Jeanne particularly, that are at that pinnacle. So the strength 60% is good. This used to be the best you could get on 5-star dragons in Dragalia, but obviously a lot of time has passed since then. And then her second ability is Raphael's Aid 2. This makes it so that if the user is attuned to light, that's just standard text, but when the user takes damage, it restores their HP and grants them the Raphael Aid's effect for 30 seconds. During Raphael's Aid, the user's defense will be increased by 50%. After activating, it won't activate again for 60 seconds. I actually kind of like this. This really does make her a nice match with Rosarda as well. Rosarda unlocks her sigil by healing, and so as she takes damage, she heals up, she unlocks her sigil. After that, she can dispel on command. I wouldn't say that Rosarda being able to dispel is especially important in Lilith. Even on the master difficulty, you can clear phase 1 before you really need to dispel. So depending on your speed, it may not be that important, but if you've been struggling with it, it could be. You know, having that dispel earlier, if you don't have like a stacked Hildegard that's just blocking everything and healing everything, it could reasonably make a difference. So I think that this is kind of cool. The 50% defense also just feels like it plays really cohesively with Rosarda, because one of Rosarda's abilities makes it so she's immune to knockback. And a lot of times what I found with Rosarda is she can heal herself enough, and her DPS is good enough that like you don't even have to run away from things. You can just tank things with her, and it feels very satisfying to do so, and then she can heal herself up and unlock her sigil a little bit faster. So having more defense feels like a really big win considering she has knockback immunity. I think that'll pair really well for her. And you get that defense buff, which is substantial for a full 30 seconds. Of course, the cooldown on this is long too, so then you're going to go 30 seconds without it. But it still seems reasonable. Every other 30 seconds, having a 50% extra defense. I think the heal on this is like pretty high recovery potency as well, so it should be a nice way to restore your HP. Another possible application I can see with this is for for players who don't have Gala Reborn Jeanne d'Arc, right? So I talked about why she's excellent as far as her damage capabilities. Another component to her, though, is Gala Reborn Jeanne d'Arc, her skill increases the user's maximum HP. That makes her really good for auto setups. This is a dragon that if you're missing Gala Reborn Jeanne d'Arc, this might be the most compelling thing that could lead you to summon here. I wouldn't say it's good enough, just not having tested it, to pull. But if you were thinking about pulling and you don't have Gala Reborn Jeanne, one consideration is, could Raphael be a substitute for, let's say, an expert Lilith auto setup on your lead adventure? And I think the answer is probably yes, but you also might be able to get away with just using Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh provides 50% strength, so a smaller amount, as well as some shadow resistance, but he is free to unbind via Draconic Essences. So in my opinion, what you should do if you're in that position is see if you can't find an auto setup that works for you using Gilgamesh. If you cannot and you really want Raphael, then maybe you go for it, you do a little bit of testing, see if she can't make it work for you, make it happen. That is one potentially cool application I could see for her. The other thing to think about is when we eventually get our Sinister Dominion content where the boss is Shadow in Phase 2, be that Azura or be that whatever future boss we have, remember that Apostle characters like Rosarda, they're going to have their sigil already unlocked in Phase 2, so this isn't actually going to speed you up, per se, in unlocking your sigil, but again, there is some auto potential here. Now, Master's not really a thing that gets autoed for farming purposes. It's just autoed to flex or to show that it can be done. But I guess that is one other consideration. And like, maybe if you're trying to flex auto Legend Tartarus, like maybe this is one of the dragons that you want to have max and bounds. Who knows? That sounds ambitious, but it's happened with a lot of the other Legend Agito, so I wouldn't be surprised if somebody does that. Anyway, y'all, I think that's pretty much all I have to say on Raphael and Isaac. This is a pretty clear no on this banner as far as I'm concerned, but I was able to think of at least a few reasons you might want Raphael at the end there. I think in an auto context, she does have some nice potential. And Isaac, maybe I'm underestimating him a little bit. I'd definitely be curious to hear what you have to say. And if you happen to summon for these characters, I'd love to hear your input as well on how well they've been working out for you. That is going to do it for today's video though, everyone. Thank you as always for watching, take care, and I'll see you next time.